Well, good morning, everyone. I'm not continuing from where I finished last time. I'm just going to backtrack a little bit to the occasion when Jesus actually selected 12 men who would become his 12 apostles. So by comparing Matthew 5 verse 1 and Mark 3 verse 13 through 15, and Luke 6 verses 12 through 13, we can tell that on a particular day when Jesus was surrounded by multitudes in the region of Galilee, and this was while the Jewish leaders were discussing how to destroy him, Jesus went away to a mountain to pray alone, and he continued praying to God all night, which suggests, of course, that the subject of this prayer time was extraordinarily important to him, something very serious in the mind and heart of Jesus, so obviously very significant that we should know what it was about. When it was daytime again, he summoned certain people to come to him who were all disciples. We don't know how many, but the fact that he called several disciples suggests to me that Jesus knew every one of them by name, and they were all possible candidates for the selection that he was about to make, because it was from this group of disciples that he specifically chose 12 men whom he named apostles, which means one sent out. Now, it is possible that he selected a bigger group than this for other reasons than besides selecting the 12. It would be more likely, would it not, that Jesus knew who he was going to select without having to have a large group around him. Maybe there were some that he thought that he would select but then reconsidered. Or maybe he wanted many witnesses to the selection. We appreciate that the apostles would bear the main burden of responsibility for testifying to the gospel in the years to come, and their authority had to be vouchsafed to the Christian community as well as to the wider Jewish community, and so that would be one good reason why Jesus selected 12 men from among a larger group of close disciples, that those disciples might also verify Jesus' selection. Well, anyway, Jesus appointed these apostles that they might continually be with him and be sent by him to preach, and also to have authority to cure people of demons. Some New Testament manuscripts add that they would have power or authority to cure diseases as well. We read that in Mark chapter 3 verse 15. It would seem that God had given Jesus full freedom and responsibility to select his 12 apostles, because we read many times in the Gospels that Jesus himself chose them. Luke chapter 6 verse 13 says so. Also, John's Gospel particularly, chapter 6 verse 70, chapter 13 verse 18, and chapter 15 verse 16. But of course, Jesus did and spoke and thought and moved in accordance with his Father's will. So whomever he selected was according to God's will. But we can be certain, as I say, that his choice was made with the insight and understanding and wisdom that came from his close, intimate fellowship with his Father. Now we know that in the Old Testament, especially, we read of some of the prophets contending with God, and we read of the angels being approached by God and asked what their opinion or their judgment is on a certain thing. So there may have been an exchange between Jesus and his Father as to whom he should select. Well, anyway, the first requirement of the apostles was that they could continually be with Jesus during his ministry. This indicates that these were men who had already proved to be ready, willing, and able to go with Jesus wherever he went, and appreciate that this was about 1.5 years into Jesus' ministry already. So he had been getting to know not only the apostles themselves, but the other disciples from whom he might have been able to select the apostles. He was getting to know their devotion to him, their commitment, their endurance, and their perseverance in the ministry thus far. They were not to know, as Jesus knew, that the times would become more difficult, more demanding, and more challenging for them mentally and emotionally. And obviously he needed men that would stick by him through thick and thin until his death. But so these were people that were ready, willing, and able to go with Jesus wherever he went. Also, they would not easily be sidetracked by other interests or cares or demands or burdens. And obviously, we all have those from time to time, whether they are family or loved ones or other sort of commitments. Jesus needed to be sure that these men would be able to be ready to go with him at a moment's notice. Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 22 also indicates that these apostles had in fact been in Jesus' presence to a greater or lesser degree from as long ago as the day that he was baptized by John. Now, from this stage, that was about 1.5 years ago. So they had had their first contact or their first observation of Jesus as long ago as Jesus' baptism. And Jesus may have known that right from the first day, but if not, then he would have learnt that from them in the time that they were spending with him over the past 1.5 years. They would have been able to testify and say what it was like to have been there and seen John give his testimony concerning Jesus after his baptism. Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 22, as I say, he's already they were with Jesus since his baptism. So even though we haven't read or heard much about these 12 men up to now, we can still be sure that during all the events of Jesus' ministry so far, they had been there in the background, watching and listening and learning about Jesus. And when I say in the background, not altogether in the background, because obviously they were very close to Jesus, so they might have been a sort of a circle of people that were with him most of the time. And their experiences were all different, of course. For example, when we read of John and Andrew being among the very first apostles to follow Jesus, we then read about Philip and others, Peter and James. And this compares with Matthew Levi, who was called by Jesus only about a year later, but had obviously been in the background in a sort of an outer circle of the disciples. And we can imagine that Matthew Levi, who was a tax collector by profession, would have been pretty intimidated about getting in the thick of the crowd of disciples, because he wouldn't have been well liked. But he liked Jesus. He liked what he was hearing, and so as much as possible he was staying in the group of disciples ever since Jesus' baptism, apparently. Jesus had chosen these 12 from out of a larger group, as I say, so it is clear that there had been many more people who had been with Jesus during his ministry so far, from as long ago as his baptism in one way or another. And we meet at least 2 of them in the very early chapters of Acts, because the apostles had to choose another apostle from the disciples to replace Judas Iscariot, who of course was dead by that time. Hopefully, we will all meet most of these men in the kingdom of God, but right now, each of the 12 apostles can be given a brief introduction. These were all Jewish men and seem to have all been from Galilee, although there's probably no need to be absolutely dogmatic on that point, although most of the signs are that they were all from Galilee. Some of them were related to Jesus, flesh and blood relatives, and many of them were closely related to each other. Now, there were at least 3 sets of brothers, and 2 of the apostles were father and son to each other. And there was possibly at least one other father-son couple among them as well. I've sort of only recently come to that theory. It's fairly certain that all of the apostles had known each other for many years, and I think very possible that they had all known Jesus even before his ministry began. Appreciate that even though no good thing could come from Nazareth, Nazareth was evidently a pretty small, pokey sort of a place, and it wasn't the sort of place that would get visitors. It was only a short walk from the capital of Galilee back in those days, which was a big, splendid city, and a lot of work was done there to beautify and enlarge that city. And so Jesus would have worked there almost certainly with his foster father Joseph, and many people would have travelled back and forth through that city, including these other disciples. Well, anyway, no points for guessing who is the best known of the 12 apostles, and that is Simon Peter. His original Hebrew name was Simeon, which is Greek, and that's where we get the name Simon. Jesus renamed him Cephas, or Peter, which means a movable rock or stone, something that you or I could actually handle and probably throw around. Simon Peter had lived in Bethsaida on the shore of the Lake Galilee. He lived in Bethsaida with his wife and mother-in-law. He had been a fisherman. His father's name was Jonah, and because Jonah's name is recorded in the Gospel of John, I suspect that Jonah also was a disciple. He was evidently known by the readers of John's Gospel in John's day. Now, another apostle is Peter's brother Andrew. He was a single man, it seemed, who lived with Peter and his family. I won't be dogmatic on that. Maybe he was married, but he appears to have been a single man who lived with Peter and his family. His name is Greek, not Jewish. So he possibly had one Greek parent, like Timothy had done, in which case he and Peter were half-brothers rather than full brothers, probably. Andrew worked with Peter as a fisherman, and he was one of the first disciples whom Jesus called. I believe he was the first alongside John, the writer of the Gospel of John. The other disciple whom Jesus called first, as I say, was probably John. Jesus' mother Mary was John's auntie. Jesus and John were blood cousins. John had also been a fisherman in partnership with Peter and Andrew. So with John's brother, that made four fishermen. John wrote the Gospel of John as well as 3 New Testament letters. In his Gospel, John sometimes refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, that is questionable to some scholars, but in the main, everybody accepts that John's Gospel was written by the Apostle John, as were the epistles. And then, of course, we get the final book of the Bible, the Apocalypse or the book of Revelation, also penned by the Apostle John, if we understand correctly. Now, John had an older brother called James. James became one of Jesus' very closest apostles, along with Peter and John, and to a lesser extent, Andrew. James had been a fishing partner with John and Peter and Andrew. The father of James and John is Zebedee, but Jesus called them sons of thunder. That's two sets of brothers so far, Peter and Andrew and James and John. There is at least one other set of brothers consisting of 2 or possibly 3 or 4 of the apostles. One of these brothers is Matthew Levi, who we have already met. He was a publican or tax collector before Jesus called him. Matthew Levi is referred to as the son of Alphaeus. Now there was another apostle who was a son of Alphaeus and was obviously Matthew Levi's brother. This other brother, his name was James. So now we have 2 apostles named James. We'll refer to him, this James, again in a few minutes. Because James was apparently quite an elder fellow, that suggests that Matthew Levi was also one of the older disciples. Now, another apostle whose name nearly always appears next to Matthew's is Thomas Didymus, who is often referred to as Doubting Thomas, though that's not a scriptural term, but it comes from Jesus' questioning of Thomas as to why he disbelieved the other apostles when they reported that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The name Thomas means twin, while Didymus means double. And significantly, Matthew Levi's name means joined. And because of these somewhat similar names, twin, double, and joined, and because Matthew and Thomas's names nearly always appear together, it is quite likely that these 2 apostles were twin brothers. Along with this list of 3 brothers, James, Matthew, and Thomas, there is a 4th apostle who is always connected with them, named Bartholomew. I should just mention too that if James was one of the older apostles, that is James the Less, James the brother of Matthew and Thomas, if he was one of the oldest apostles, as he seems to have been, then that suggests that Matthew and Thomas were both among the older apostles. But as I say, there's a 4th apostle who is always connected with them, and his name is Bartholomew. Because Bartholomew means son of Talmai, this might suggest Bartholomew had a different mother or father from the other 3 brothers, more likely a different father. So maybe he was a half-brother to James, Matthew, and Thomas. Now, I mentioned in an earlier episode concerning the Gospels that the evidence indicates, beyond reasonable doubt, I think, that Bartholomew is the same person as Nathanael in John chapter 1, verse 45, who was certainly one of the very earliest apostles that Jesus called. Now, this indicates that Bartholomew was one of the earliest disciples to be called by Jesus. He was the disciple who thought that no good thing could come out of Nazareth. Presumably, but not certainly, but presumably he'd been to Nazareth and didn't think much of it. This identification of Bartholomew with Nathanael also indicates that he was from the town of Cana. That's referred to in John chapter 21, verse 2. And Cana, of course, is where Jesus performed his first sign miracle of turning water into wine. And as it happens, Cana was very close to the town of Nazareth. We can be almost sure that Bartholomew and James and Matthew and even Thomas were all at that wedding in Cana, and that they all witnessed the sign miracle, and that it was there that they first believed in Jesus. The Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, he also had a son who was chosen to be an apostle. So that immediately sets James in the older category. The son was presumably of, in his late teens or possibly early 20s, in which case James, the son of Alphaeus, may have been in his 40s or 50s. So his son is named Judas. And this, of course, is not Judas Iscariot, who eventually betrayed Jesus. The King James Version says that Judas was a brother of James, but the more correct translations accept that Judas was James's son. In view of the fact that Judas's grandfather Alphaeus was evidently still alive and well known to the Christians many years after Jesus' ministry, then at this time when Jesus selected the apostles, when he first called these 12 men to be apostles, Judas, the son of James, was probably quite young, possibly still as young as his mid-teens. But he had to be the sort of person that could foot it with the older men and was mentally and emotionally disposed to endure and to persevere with some of the crises or some of the predicaments that they might come across, which is not typical of kids in their mid-teens today. And of course, I called them kids, and we tend to connect people in their mid-teens as still children. And a lot of universities are testifying that they're finding that even people in their mid-20s who are still attending university are becoming more and more childlike. So, but back in these days, I would say somebody who even was as young as 13 and had their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah in those days would have been expected to be fully responsible as an adult. Officially, that was when they went from childhood into adulthood. So we can be certain that Judas, the son of James, was a very responsible young man, probably pretty level-headed. There is no need to be amazed or skeptical about Judas's selection. The Apostle Paul chose Timothy to be a fellow worker at a time when Timothy was certainly a teenager. In this case, Judas's father was probably in his late 30s or early 40s. I suggested he could have been in his 50s. And so he was possibly the oldest of the apostles. So here we now have a third set of closely related apostles, possibly four brothers: James, Matthew, Thomas, and Bartholomew. We have a son, Judas, the son of James. He's also called Lebbaeus, or known as Thaddeus. This leaves three apostles who don't seem to have been related to any of the other apostles. There is Philip, and he's the first of these remaining three apostles. According to John chapter 1, verse 43, Philip was unusual in that Jesus himself also actually searched for Philip to call him to be a disciple. Jesus, as it were, took the initiative and went out of his way to look for Philip. Like Andrew, the name Philip is Greek, so it is likely that both Andrew and Philip were part Jewish, part Greek Galileans. And in that case, Philip possibly looked lighter and more European than the other darker, more Oriental apostles. This might explain why Greeks approached Philip at John chapter 12, verse 20, on the last week of Jesus' ministry. Now, quite often we'll see Palestinians and Israelis being interviewed on TV, and of course, because of the mix of different races that have been through the Holy Land over 2,000 years, but also the mix of different races that have affected the Jewish people over the last 2,000 years, wherever they've spread to. They're quite indistinguishable sometimes, your Palestinians and your Israelis. So what I said about Philip's appearance, or Andrew's for that matter, just has to be taken with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily true. But it would suggest one of the reasons that Greeks who were in the temple grounds actually approached Philip rather than any of the other apostles. Maybe they just recognized that he was of their sort of ilk. Philip seems to have known Peter and Andrew. That's according to John chapter 1 verse 45, and this would stand to reason because they lived in the same city. Philip was evidently a close associate of Bartholomew or Nathanael because he searched for Philip at John 1 verse 45 to introduce him to Jesus. The 11th apostle was Simon, who was called the Zealot. In Matthew and Mark's Gospels, he is referred to as Simon the Canaanite or the Canaanian in the King James Version. But the original word again means zealot, and it does not refer to the land of Canaan or to the town of Cana in Galilee. So here was Simon, who is distinguished by the word zealot. Simon's title, the Zealot, tells us that this apostle was, or at least had been, a member of the Jewish Zealot Party, which was a revolutionary group committed to resisting Roman occupation. Simon would have been the sort of person who wanted to use force to bring about the political and spiritual restoration of Israel, and he would have been violently opposed to people who tolerated or befriended the Gentiles in the Holy Land. And this is interesting to me because it means that Jesus was not averse to that sort of a personality amongst his very close disciples. If you want to get some concept of who this Simon the Zealot may have been like, just watch your TV news and imagine Simon not amongst the Israelis, but among the Hamas in Gaza, for example. That was the sort of fervour and the sort of violence that the zealots amongst the Israelites and especially amongst the Galileans were famous for. I should note, because it is instructive, people were very disparaging of Hamas for the way that they buried tunnels under Gaza. People were calling them rats and all this sort of thing. And of course those tunnels are very illustrative of not only their desperation, but also of the way that they fleeced money from the Gazan people to build these tunnels instead of hospitals and schools, etc. But the fact is that the zealots among the Jews were famous for doing exactly the same thing in Galilee. And we don't know a lot about the Bar Kokhba revolution, which happened in about AD 130, but the tunnel systems that they created were very extensive. And so they were of the same ilk, if you like, as even Hamas. And I'm not trying to disparage the Jewish zealots in any way by saying that, but it gives you an idea of the same sort of temperament, the same sort of personality, and the same sort of fervour that these people had. And yet Jesus said, "He's my man. He's the man for me." So the final apostle, and one of the best known, was of course Judas Iscariot. He is referred to as the traitor in Luke's Gospel, and as the one who also betrayed Jesus in Matthew and Mark's Gospel. Luke chapter 22 verse 3 indicates that the word Iscariot was a label or a title. Now some scholars believe it refers to Judas's hometown in Judea, a place called Kerioth. But this is just a guess, and in fact many places of Israel had the same name, which just means building or town. In fact, just following the news, you'll often hear reference to places with the name Kiriath or Kiriot in them. It simply means town. For example, Richard and Bronwyn and we were on a kibbutz right next to a place called, another kibbutz called Kiryat Arta, and that simply means the town of Arta. And yesterday there was reference to Israelis in Israel based at a place called Kiryat Gat in Gaza. And of course Gat refers to Gath, where Goliath came from. And of course that word Kiryat simply means city or town, so town of Gat. So it's still a current name, a very common name. Another option is that Iscariot, as in Judas Iscariot, is drawn from the tribal name Issachar. That's a long shot, but that is a possibility. Other scholars think that the name is connected with the Israelite tribe of Issachar, as I say, which occupied southern Galilee, and that would suggest that Judas Iscariot had his ancestry or his hometown in that region in Galilee. Now, other scholars suggest that Iscariot was a title that Jesus gave to Judas, meaning a man of preaching, or a man with the apron or the bag or pouch, because Jesus entrusted Judas with the disciples' money. Other scholars suggest meanings such as bribery, strangulation, or separation, which are all significant to Judas, but they're difficult to prove. But it just goes to show how that you can take a word from the Bible and look into the Greek or into the Hebrew, and depending on your bent or your predisposition or your preconception, you can come up with so many different theories about it. It's just a valuable lesson to take, how they can't all be true, but obviously some people that came up with them thought, oh, this must be the answer. And one of them may be, but I don't know. Much later in the Gospels, at John chapter 12, verse 4, we learn that Judas had a father named Simon. On the basis of this, and several other passages in the Gospels, there is a case for believing that Judas Iscariot was the brother of 3 of Jesus' closest friends. Now, even though I say much later in the Gospels at John chapter 12, verse 4, we learn that Judas had a father named Simon, we actually learn about that earlier in John chapter 6, verse 71, because he's explicitly called there Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon Iscariot. Now, as I say, on the basis of this and several other passages in the Gospels, there is a case for believing that Judas Iscariot was the brother of 3 of Jesus' closest friends, namely Martha, Mary, and Lazarus of the town of Bethany. In connection with this theory, it would seem that the leper whom Jesus healed back in Luke 5 was actually Judas's father, a man who is later referred to in Matthew 26 and Mark 14 as Simon the leper. We don't really know any more about this leper than what we read, and then later on we read about a Simon the leper. And so we have to wonder, and it is a possibility, that those 2 references to the unnamed leper and to the man Simon the leper are one and the same person. Whatever else we might learn about Judas Iscariot, we can be sure that he, just like the other 11 whom Jesus chose, that Judas was suitably qualified, as far as it went naturally, to be a true apostle of Jesus. That is, a true ambassador or representative. Whatever it was that it took to be called by Jesus to be an apostle, and appreciate that these were all very diverse men, Judas met the criteria. Jesus had seen in Judas and in the other men the sorts of personalities and character traits that Jesus could make good use of. Here were men who had heard and accepted John the Baptist's call to repent and to bring forth fruits worthy of repentance. These 12 men had shown that they wished to lead lives of holiness, to please and to honour God. They were willing to change. Here too were men who had shown that they were willing to do as John said and to follow that man Jesus. John had obviously testified of Jesus at Jesus' baptism at a time when these 12 men were all there. They witnessed the baptism, not knowing Jesus from Adam, obviously, at the time. Jesus disappeared into the crowd, but there was John suddenly realizing, having been had it revealed to him by the Father, that this was his anointed Son, in whom God was well pleased. And when John gave his testimony on by the waters there, these 12 men were there hearing it, and they took it to heart. And later on, when John said, "Follow that man," they had a heart and mind to do that. So they were, for the past year and a half now, they had proved that they were open and receptive to Jesus' words and behaviour that were proving to be so radical and challenging and provocative. The leaders were getting irritated by Jesus, but obviously these 12 disciples were becoming more and more enthralled by what Jesus had to do and say. So far, they had not stumbled or balked at the fact that Jesus was different and unconventional and controversial. Most people would prefer to stay at arm's length from somebody that was controversial, and certainly stay away from them once they realised that the powers that be were out to get them or to actually kill them. And yet these were men that stayed with Jesus. While the Jewish religious leaders had continually been offended and upset and irritated by Jesus, these 12 men had continued to trust in him and to devote themselves to him. They trusted his integrity and virtue. For a year and a half, these men had continued with Jesus, always in the background, behind the scene, among the crowds. Some of them were probably a bit more outgoing than others. Some of them possibly approached Jesus much more than the others did. Jesus could tell that they would not quickly give up on him or be easily distracted from following him. This perseverance and endurance was something Jesus had noticed and appreciated. Obviously, he appreciated it in all those in the crowds that manifested that, but here were 12 that had this particular strength. Now, a few months ago, during the Passover festival back in Jerusalem, Jesus had invited or appealed to the Jewish religious leaders to take my yoke upon you. He first said, "Come to me, all ye who are burdened, who are weary and heavy laden." And of course, he was talking in the context of the religious leaders, he was talking about the law. The law was burdensome. The law was something that was going to bring them to death. But Jesus says, "You take my yoke upon you and learn of me." Those men, the religious leaders, had refused to accept Jesus' offer. But now Jesus had found 12 men who had shown that they would accept Jesus' invitation. And from a distance, they had been learning of Jesus. From now on, these 12 would be yoked to Jesus more closely and with greater challenges than they had known before. They would not only be yoked to Jesus, but also to each other to a greater or lesser degree. Obviously, when Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you," he doesn't expect everybody to be yoked to each other, but that one-on-one relationship means that they were each yoked to Jesus in their own way. But as I say, they were involved with one another also to that same degree. And that mixture of relationships would be challenging by itself. Impetuous Peter would irritate cautious Thomas. Nationalistic Simon the Zealot would have resented Matthew Levi, who had collaborated with the Romans. Legalistic Judas would create tensions with generous Philip or gracious John. These 12 apostles would still have a lot to learn, but Jesus was confident of their willingness and their ability to be taught and led and corrected and admonished. A useful exercise for each of us is to ask whether you or I could have been chosen in the place of any of these men. Now that Jesus had recruited or enlisted his special representatives, it was now a good time to begin teaching them and the multitudes more of the high calling to which they had all been called. It is at this time then, about a year and a half or halfway into his ministry, that the so-called Sermon on the Mount actually takes place. The sermon might more accurately have been called the Sermon at the Mount, but he gave this sermon because he had already called his apostles and probably had them near him when he was speaking. And they would have probably interrupted from time to time and asked questions of what he was saying. So the Sermon on the Mount was directed at the multitudes in general, but also more particularly to his very close disciples. And we can be sure that the sermon as recorded in the New Testament in Matthew and in Luke was actually a lot longer than what it is recorded in the scriptures. And I could well imagine some of these apostles basically at Jesus' feet asking him to explain something along the way. And certainly they would have done that after the sermon as they were going on their way back to Capernaum. So hopefully as we consider these men later on in the gospel record, we'll have a better concept of what sort of men they were and what sort of disciples they were to Jesus.